Welcome to another election edition of TERF Talk Down Under. I'm Stassja and this is Ange. G'day.
Hi, Stass. Hi, everybody. How are you?
Yeah, what another circus week.
I'm exhausted. I say it every week. I'm exhausted, but I'm more exhausted every week.
Yeah. Where shall we start? Kath Deves. Look, she's been on 2GB radio this morning with Ben Fordham. I only listened to half of it because I had to do my makeup and get ready for TERF Talk. But it sounded good. She sounds very much like a politician, which, fair enough. But she did the SBS interview this week. I thought what they aired on the telly was only half the story, and they chose the worst bits.
Yeah, we've noticed that they do that with everything regarding Kath. They try and portray her as anti-trans, even when she says something that is quite moderate.
Yeah.
They do it to all of us. What am I saying? They do it to everybody. They try and cherry pick comments to make us look bigoted and nasty when we're actually posing rational, objective opinions.
The one that I was thinking about last night, where I think Kath could have grounds for defamation cases if she was to pursue it, was the quote about 50% of trans women are sexual offenders. But they've left off the crucial bit at the end where she said in the male estate, and she's referring to men's prisons.
Yeah. See, I don't understand why the Australian Federal Police and the Press Council aren't involved in this, because it's gone beyond reporting and it's become targeted harassment. Like, they've gone into her deleted Twitter profile and dredging up things to make her look bad deliberately. And there's also something that was pointed out to me. There's this argument that the transgender community is dangerously mentally ill, right? Because they're all threatening suicide, that there are, make me laugh, that they're a vulnerable, mentally ill community who deserves support. And at the same time, journalists like Susie O'Brien and Samantha Maiden and a bunch of others are inciting the very same community to target people who don't agree with them, people like Kath Deves. And then when Kath Deves says, I've received rape and death threats, they are discrediting her and saying, oh, but the local police don't have a report of that, when, as we all know, it's a federal police issue. And even if they were investigating it, it wouldn't be reported publicly. So it's very evil what's actually going on here, and the degree of targeted harassment, which is an offence, and particularly using a carriage service to target, to incite targeted harassment. Like, it's getting beyond just sloppy journalism, and it's getting into dangerous territory, particularly for people like us who are public but don't have the benefit of being politicians and have the support of the AFP.
Oh, look, it's been so grubby. I've always known that the media can't really 100% be trusted, but this whole experience, just watching what's happening to Kath, it just gives so much insight to how much influence the media has, how much they manipulate public opinion. And, these aren't elected people. It's just outrageous. But yeah, what you were saying, I don't know what's word. I find it amusing that under every single fucking article about Kath, there is a little line that says, contact Lifeline, the suicide hotline, if you're experiencing blah, blah, blah. And SBS, they ran this story called Have a Shred of Empathy. All they platformed were vulnerable trans women and talked about how phone calls to the help hotlines have gone up, and that the media needs to stop reporting on this stuff. And it's like they cannot handle having their worldview exposed to the world, because they've been flying under the radar for so long in this country. It's just outrageous.
I posted on some, I don't know, what's her name? Some woman from the TV, Julie or something, made some comment, trans people are welcome in my kitchen table or some rubbish. And I said, well, who's going to advocate for the women in single sex services, crisis services, who their services have been invaded by biological males? Who's going to advocate for them? And there's all these ha-has all over my comment.
Yeah.
Like, what kind of human being thinks of rape victims, male or female, people in rehabs, people in mental health units, elderly people, vulnerable people who request single sex services and then have a male in the middle of them. And then they also know, because of the media and because of, the fact the male is actually in the room, that they don't have a right to object. Like, how can anyone not have empathy for them that at least equals the empathy they have for these marginalised blokes?
Yeah.
It's so frustrating. And as you all know, I've been screeching about this for 4 or 5 years when I started to, hear stories of males invading women-only services. And since self-ID's come in Victoria, I've actually started to experience it myself. And I've been silenced at every turn.
Oh, no, you're frozen.
Oh.
Your video.
Hello?
Your video's frozen, but
oh, have I
can still hear you.
I'm here. There you are.
There you are.
Oh, you could still hear me, could you? It's probably better.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's so frustrating because, I think, why hasn't anyone from the media said, okay, Miss Jones, can you legitimise your claims? Can you tell me where this has occurred? Can you tell me to what degree this is happening? And I'll obviously refer them to Holly's site, but nobody has ever asked me, to prove what I'm saying, because it doesn't matter to them. They don't care that vulnerable women are being impacted by self-ID and that this is a men's rights activist thing. They don't care.
I was thinking about it last night with the self-ID laws. What it comes down to is trans activists are saying that women being raped or sexually assaulted is an acceptable sacrifice for these fucking men. That's what they're saying. They don't. And just this week, there was the news out of the USA that trans-identified male has been sentenced to a further 7 years in prison for raping a female prisoner, because he was put in the bloody women's prison. So, that, like, it's never acceptable. It's not an acceptable risk. Just
what about
so angry?
Yeah, what about there's a nurse here in Australia, a trans-identified nurse who has been convicted of sexual assault, and the media are using female pronouns to report on it. Her penis.
Yeah, look, we'll talk about that one with our guest, because I know our guest has probably read the entire court report.
But this never happens. This never happens. There's all this denial out there. And we know people like Danny Laidley, who have recent convictions for domestic violence, have transed their crimes away and are now celebrated for being stunning and brave. We know it's happening. Richard Pusey, Reginald Arthurall, all of the serial killers. It's just insane. The gaslighting.
Absolutely. And there was even, the domestic violence hotline here in Victoria, Respect Victoria, just yesterday put a post on their Facebook page saying trans women are women, respect trans women. And it just made me so angry. I emailed them. I
did too.
I sent them a link to Trans Widows Voices. I said, you need to, I cannot believe that such a service is so woefully uneducated on what happens to women whose partners transition. They, these AGPs subject these women to exactly the same sorts of coercive control and abuse as just your average man. Like, it's just appalling. I couldn't believe it.
The clue is in the .vic.gov.au, because as we know, the Victorian state government is signed up to ACON's workplace index, where their lucrative workplace index, where they receive points and other benefits for promoting trans propaganda and ignoring anything remotely anti-trans. So, all government orgs, the education department, the police, anything public service is signed up to this through the state government. So their funding and their very existence depends on signing up for this pro-trans propaganda. And it's the same as the Stonewall thing in the UK, but our media refuses point blank to expose it. And people have done some really good work. Kit Kowalski, Katerina, they've done some fantastic work to expose this crap. And the media is just like this. It's so frustrating because it's so obvious.
It's mind-boggling. You saw I got that piece in the Australian this week.
Yeah, well done. Legitimate journalist here. She's got a piece in the mainstream media here. Well done.
I really wanted to highlight, the ABC and the SBS's capture by ACON. And my hope was that some journalist out there who's actually getting paid to do the work would pick up on it and would start investigating further, like the reaches of ACON. Like, it's an absolute scandal.
But then the Press Council not, allowing Samantha Maiden and people like that to bully Kath Deves. The fact that the media are reporting biological male criminals as female, like, it's just so, like, ridiculous that anything is possible. Like, we're in that dystopian world where, reality doesn't exist.
Yeah. Oh, mate, it's so upside down. Kit Kowalski actually did an excellent piece just laying out ACON's involvement in the development of the transgender inclusion guidelines. I encourage everyone to have a look at it. I'll put a link in the description. All of the sporting federations, all of the peak bodies for like rugby, netball, and so on, were already paying members of ACON's Pride in Sport scam when the guidelines were being developed. Even the, what they call it, the Australian Sports Commission, which is is a federal government department, were paying members. The Australian Human Rights Commission were paying members. So, it's unsurprising that they chose to present an interpretation of that section of the Sex Discrimination Act, which is completely out of step with the intention of the Act to protect female sports. And so when you see dickheads like Kieran Perkins, who's the CEO of the Sports Commission, say shit like, the peak bodies for sporting here in Australia already got together and decided the guidelines. They've got it right. That's what he's saying. But he's not disclosing that those guidelines may as well have been written by ACON. It's just, and so I actually did a second article all based on Kit Kowalski's research there. And the Australian were like, oh, sorry, we can't print it so close to your other one. So
hopefully they'll still print it.
Well, she said she'd send it on to the news desk to see if they would run it in their section of the Australian, but it hasn't been printed. So I'm going to try elsewhere. But I just don't understand these journalists. Like, this is an absolute scandal. that they could expose it. They could do, like Stephen Nolan's report on Stonewall in the UK. They could totally run with that, embarrass the shit out of the ABC and SBS and force ACON out of all these government departments. I don't know. How do people not see the scandal?
I think they do, but they've been censored. Like I know there are journalists who follow me on Twitter, and don't go looking for them because I want them to stay there, because at least they're getting the other side of the argument. But I know there are people, and they're not all right-wingers, that are aware of what's going on. And I also have been sending information to specific journalists for years to enlighten them about what's going on. And I haven't been blocked, and I haven't been, told to piss off. So I know that there are people out there who are just watching and waiting. But, when are they going to speak up? When are they going to speak up?
Oh, mate, the media is so captured here. Like the ABC, I've noticed the last week, they're just not reporting on Kath Deves. They're just not running stories on trans issues. They've done one this week, and they platformed an activist, a trans activist endocrinologist.
Oh, her. She was the one on Insight. Yeah, very professional. My children saw an endocrinologist for early onset puberty, and I actually asked them, and they talked about because my daughter started developing at 7, and I said, at what point do you put children on puberty blockers? And she said, oh, we don't, unless there's like really advanced development, because they're so dangerous later in life. And they're the words that they said to me. Now, the amount of puberty blockers my daughter would have gone on would have been minuscule compared to a trans identifying child. And yet it was, she's, the endocrinologist at the Royal Children's Hospital, where all this gender stuff actually goes on, said to me, no, it's too dangerous for your child.
There you go. Yeah. And you had some encounter with a psychologist this week.
Yeah, because I've got a couple of kids on the autism spectrum. So, we have, and also I'm studying counselling. And so, we're in contact with a lot of mental health professionals and experts in certain areas. And I spoke to another psychologist, a clinical psychologist, who I would have thought was one of the Be Kind brigade, and who I know is a lefty, bit of an inner city kind of type, pretty cool. And I would have thought they would have been, be nice to trans, and I don't agree that they should be in all women only spaces, but give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe include them in sport, whatever. Like most people don't realise how much this trans stuff goes on, and that we aren't talking about transsexuals, that we're actually talking about AGPs. So I thought this guy'd be a bit of a moderate, and I mentioned something about the election, and he said, oh, look, I've voted Labor my whole life, but I'm not voting for them. And I, of course, went, what? Because that's me. And he said, yeah, this woke capture, they've gone too far. And I said, what do you mean? And he doesn't know I'm a TERF. And he said, oh, the gender stuff, the militarization of the police force, the bias in the media, and he's saying all this stuff, and I'm going, oh yes, and I said, oh yeah, I'm quite outspoken about the gender stuff. And then he started, going on about autism, blah blah blah, and he said, all my colleagues are with me.
Wow, yeah.
And every psychologist, psychiatrist, or other professional I've spoken to has raised alarm about this gender stuff. And he said, look, gender dysphoria is still in our diagnostic criteria, but I can get in trouble if I don't affirm any child that comes to me. And I said, yeah, you get it. So it was really comforting for me, because it proves that the word's getting out there in amongst the mainstream. He didn't know what a TERF was, but he still knew all the arguments. And I thought that was really interesting. And he mentioned J.K. Rowling and the pile-on on her, and how unfair that is, and everything that she's done for children, only for her to be demonised. And I'm going, wow, the masses are getting it. And I mentioned Kath Deves, and he said, oh yeah, the poor thing, I wouldn't vote Liberal, but what's happened to her is horrendous. And I'm like, hallelujah. So yeah, it gave me a lot of hope in a week where I felt quite defeated. I mean, a lot of us have, I don't think people overseas understand, like you said, how captured our media are, and that it is an onslaught of pro-trans propaganda and demonization of women like us.
I just can't believe it. Like, even The Age and the Herald Sun are just running with this demonization of Kath Deves and pro-trans kids bullshit. Like, they are in for a shock when the election results come in, I think. They're going to be like, whoa, we were really out of touch on all of this. But look, our guest has arrived, so I'm going to bring her in. So we've been alternating with a lefty, then a righty, and this week we're up to a left-leaning woman. We have the wonderful Janet Fraser joining us, and now she works on Women's Declaration International.
Hey.
Welcome, Janet. How are you going?
Janet.
Hello. It's lovely to see you both.
Likewise. So we've just been talking about the election, but so let's change topic. Let's start with, did you have a peak trans moment, Janet, or how did you become aware that this was a serious issue for women's rights?
Well, back in about 2010, I was doing a lot of feminist writing on the interwebs when we had blogs, which, younger watchers may not know about. And I was sometimes involved in blog carnivals. So somebody would host and they would put up links to a whole lot of blog posts, generally on a theme. Sometimes I did them on general feminist topics. Sometimes they were on birthing women's topics. And it was explained to me by one of the women who ran the then Hoydens About Town blog, which was terrific and has been archived by the National Library, that because I was transphobic, I was never going to get ahead in Australian feminism. And I was very curious about what this meant because I'd never said a thing, I'd never written a thing. Of course, you can be a transphobe by commission or omission. And I was a transphobe by omission because I kept writing these pesky articles about birthing women. So that was one moment. And there were previous moments. There was another major one back in the 90s when the Lesbian Space Project fell apart over the question of should men be allowed to join and pretend to be lesbians in the lesbian space. And older friends of mine, so women in their 40s and 50s back in the 90s when I was a young thing, said to me, if we don't carve out spaces for women and for lesbians particularly, all spaces become men's spaces, which of course is something that Sheila Jeffries has said. And so when queer came along and I went to the first queer conference in Sydney, this is what lesbian women said to me about this stuff. And I didn't really know what to think. You know, I was young, I was politically inexperienced at that point, and yet prepared to listen to my older, wiser elders because they were older and wiser and had been around and had been proper second wave feminists, not just coming in on the end of it like me. So it was moments like that that kind of happened over the years, you know, and I remember reading Sheila Jeffries in the early 2000s and thinking, well, okay, sure, but isn't there a place for kindness? And that seems like broad strokes and it's very general, sort of having a bit of a not all men moment. And of course, I'm right down with that now. I have very clear boundaries around that stuff. And in the end, what drove me to actually speaking up publicly rather than letting it wallow in the background, because I perceived it correctly, I think, as a wedge issue. It's designed to split the women's movement, and it has. So for a long time, I just didn't really say anything. And then around 2015, 2016, we had the campaign to legalise abortion in Ireland. Originally, I'm a historian of Irish history. And so I feel a great connection with women in Ireland, even though I primarily wrote about men. And I watched the trans takeover of the language in this campaign. and the rage that I felt could have been heard for miles. We had the unbelievable abuses of women's human rights in a country like Ireland based on women's sex, right? Not about how we felt. You didn't get asked if you felt like a fella when they locked you up in a Magdalen laundry for life. You didn't get asked if you felt like a fella when you were a 14-year-old girl sent to prison because your father had raped you. That happened in the 1940s, right? So between that and the women who were survivors of symphysiotomy, who were having a terrible time at that time in Irish history as well, and then equal marriage,
just for people
it was, drove me to speak up.
Sorry, just for people who don't know, what's a symphysiotomy?
Symphysiotomy. A symphysiotomy is where the gristle that joins the bones of a woman's pelvis at the front is severed. It's cut in order to birth a baby. Except, of course, that doesn't help anybody birth a baby. All it does is break a woman's pelvis and cause her to become significantly disabled.
Yeah.
So those women, who are generally older women now, because they stopped doing it, thank God, in about the 80s, were seeking redress and having a really terrible time through the court system. So at the start of the week, a group of those women were denied the right to seek redress, which we call it compensation, they call it redress. And then at the end of the week, equal marriage was voted on, and this was considered a great victory, right? So, the rage drove me to it. So even I felt a little bit tentative at that time, and it's not like I did a both sides or any of that nonsense, but I started speaking up, and it was a bit scary at first, and now I'm completely over that. So that's my my peak trans journey.
Yeah,
the time for volume 2, 3 and 4 now, because that's extensive.
That's it.
Yeah.
Now, you were involved in pushing back, I believe, I think it was New South Wales abortion legislation where they sought to remove the word mother, I think. I think this was before I got involved. So can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. New South Wales's abortion legislation, which we fought for 119 years, does not contain the words woman, women, female anywhere. And this bill was the darling of Alex Greenwich, who loves the sex trade, loves the surrogacy trade, loves the trans, is a gay man, is all over the queer. And it was very curious because not terribly long before his bill popped up, there had been a bill put up by Marine Faruqi, so brown Muslim woman. Her bill didn't get up, was almost identical, did include the word woman a bit though. And then I see that this abortion bill appears to be racing ahead and everybody's supporting it, and there's a coalition of groups that are supporting it, and there's like 60 groups supporting it and all pushing, and I'm thinking, what the hell? How did we suddenly get this kind of impetus? That's how we got that kind of impetus, was put up by the white boy, the gay boy, who's all over the queer and raised women. So the price of legal abortion in New South Wales was to completely obliterate women. So all the women who've died from lack of legal, safe abortion, all the women who went to prison, all gone, who cares, whatever. People are having abortions now in New South Wales.
Outrageous.
Well, people have been having abortions and miscarriages and giving birth in Australia since 2013. Like, men are having babies according to our legislation. So, it was a logical step.
You even did a little bit of research into, well, how many trans men have had babies in this country? How did that go?
At the time I did that research, which I think was 2019, I think that's when I presented that research in Brisbane, there had been about 22. So, I had to Google how to do a percentage, and then I'm carefully doing it on my phone. It was like 0.00 something.
Do you know, it's still the only reason that trans men make the news when they have babies.
Always. Yeah.
Ironic, isn't it?
Oh, utterly. You know, the objectification that so many of these women are fleeing just arrives in a whole other form, particularly when you see those nudie photos on Instagram or on Facebook, because now they've got man nipples, not lady nipples. So, you know, you see the plastic surgeons putting up the before and afters. So before the double mastectomy, the nipples are covered, and after the double mastectomy, the nipples are free. We finally got freed the nipple, right?
Oh, it's
just had to cut your breasts off first, but then you can free the nipple.
Yeah.
Yay.
It is maddening, absolutely maddening. Now, what do you make of the Kath Deves situation and how it's gone? It's been quite the media storm. I understand you were at the centre of a quite serious media storm about 10 years ago or so. What can you?
That's the first time I heard of Janet was through the media storm that involved her all those years ago. And I was very pleased to come into the feminist rooms and find her there and hear from her side, you know, because she was misrepresented badly by the media. And I remember thinking that at the time.
Yes, well, it is rather one of the hazards of being a woman who speaks publicly for women, isn't it? Mm-hmm. I have written quite a lot about that experience, in fact, a book. But it talks about lots of other things as well. But yeah, the media stuff is very curious, and it's a very weird feeling. And I imagine Kath is feeling a lot of weird things right now. I think hopefully what will get Kath through is her feminist critique, because that's what got me through. And I was really well aware that if it hadn't been me, it would have been somebody else. And in Kath's situation, she is absolutely being made an example of, in the hope that the rest of us will all sit down and shut up and just let the men go for it, which of course is not what's happening, because we're women's liberationists and we don't pay attention to that. I haven't read a lot of the coverage about Kath, because it's not really about Kath. It's about the straw woman that the media constructs and then rips apart with carefully curated snippety quotes of hers, and then heartfelt pleas for kindness, and the talk about the suicide myth and the murder myth and all that kind of stuff. So it's all just a plea to be kind and all of that. For me, I would say perfectly reasonable things like hospital staff should obey the law. Women should not be coerced, forced or assaulted while giving birth. We actually have law about that in Australia, and autonomy in the healthcare system. And then I might say something like, our caesarean rate is too high. Of course, these are perfectly reasonable things to say, so long as you're not a woman who's talking about women's autonomy. And if you are a woman talking about women's autonomy, then all of that goes into the mincing machine and comes out the other end with Janet Fraser thinks mothers and babies should die instead of have caesareans. No, that's really not what I said. So, this stuff about Kath thinks trans people should die, or, whatever bullshit they're coming up with now. No, she actually just said that men aren't changing sex and men shouldn't be in women's spaces. Yeah, it is a silencing tactic on the part of our media, which of course is a corporate media. Does anybody seriously look at media in Australia and go, that's where I'm getting my information?
Not anymore.
Really? Do we?
Not anymore.
I hope not.
No.
The minute there's something in the paper that you know about, you stop believing the newspapers.
Yeah. Yeah. That's like anything to do with this whole argument that until it affects you personally, you think you know about it, and then it affects you personally, and then you really know about it. Yeah.
Well, that's like it is for anything reported about women in the media, isn't it? And the fact that there are so many liberal feminist commentators saying things like, oh, well, of course I condemn violence, but, she shouldn't have joined the Liberal Party. What's that supposed to mean? Of course, I condemn violence against all women, especially the really vulnerable women who are actually men, but Kath shouldn't have. It's the same old, sit down, shut up, keep your mouth shut. You attracted it. It's your fault. You provoked him. We've seen all of this before.
The bulk of it has been tone policing, like surgically sterilized and mutilated. The number of times that has been repeated on like all the news outlets is just crazy. And
I keep asking people, what do you think happens when you prevent puberty in children? What do you think happens? What is the basic purpose of puberty? Well, it does a whole lot of brain maturation stuff. It gets you growing, but it makes you fertile. So if you prevent that from happening, what do you think that is? But I don't think they have a particularly good euphemism for sterilizing children, because having to be sterilized in order to change your birth certificate is something that they whinge about a lot. No, people have said to you, well, if you want to be the opposite sex, you should have the surgery or the hormones or whatever it is. That looks like a commitment to that. I don't think that's right either, because no one's changing sex. But it's curious that they're prepared to use the term sterilized in that scenario on adults.
Yeah.
But somehow we're not supposed to notice that if you give children puberty suppressants, they don't become fertile.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's just maddening. I've forgotten what my next question was. Ange, do you?
Oh, I don't know. I've got a list on my phone. What have we talked about?
Well, actually,
we're like this, every single day there's so much stuff in the media. It's all negative, and we're like trying to catch it all, and it's not always possible. God, there's so much.
Actually, that was what I was going to ask, because you run Australian Parents Questioning Gender. What's been the mood amongst parents with regards to the coverage with Kath Deves?
Parents have a really difficult road to tread in countries like Australia, where there have been a number, I don't know how many, but a number of children removed from their families because their families wouldn't support them being sterilised and given iatrogenic doses of the wrong sex hormones. So most parents are kind of keeping their heads down, really. The parents who are comfortable speaking up are doing a bit of speaking up via their own social media outlets, and that's Twitter or Facebook or wherever they go. But I think for most people it's having the effect that it's intended to have, which is to silence opposition and to make people feel fearful and in the wrong. And who wants to be associated with racists and misogynists and homophobes? And, these are things that our cultural pressures in Australia have made really severely off limits to people who feel like they're progressives. No, it's one of the worst things you can do is call someone a white supremacist. But as soon as you publicly say that sex is real, you somehow morph into a white supremacist as well. So, yeah, I get called that one too. But, that is the way that the gaslighting of this movement works, isn't it? You say ABC, they translate it as XYZ, and then you are condemned on the XYZ.
Janet, do you have many parents who have, taken their child to a gender clinic, and their child has been affirmed, and down the track they've gone, hang on? Because the parents that I know knew nothing about this until their child came home and said, I am transgender. And they did what any parent who wasn't aware would do, and took them to a GP who referred them to the gender clinic, who then filled their head with bullshit like, if you don't let your child transition, they will kill themselves. And they've felt that they've had no choice, and they've gone down this path. Now, these are people that I know. They're reasonably rational thinking adults that trust the medical establishment, particularly someone with the reputation of the Royal Children's Hospital. They trust that their children are in good hands. So a lot of people, particularly on our side, don't really understand the indoctrination of parents and how that must impact on them. So I'm wondering if, you get parents a couple of years down the track that come to you and say, this was a terrible mistake?
Not yet.
No.
Most of the people who join that particular group are fighting desperately to keep their kids out of it.
Yeah.
So they've been lucky enough to, when their child comes home and says, I'm actually a boy, they've looked it up and not felt okay about it. And because those of us who are speaking up and saying this is not okay and this is why actually do have a little bit of presence now on the interwebs, which is where everybody looks, of course, it means that people do find that stuff and they know not to take their child to a psychologist, particularly if you live somewhere like Victoria or Queensland, right? So there are a lot of people trying to see the few psychologists, psychiatrists who are brave enough in Australia to say, no, I don't affirm. I'm interested in your child's overall well-being, not agreeing with them about their personal diagnosis instantly. So those people are highly sought after, and they're doing a lot of Zoom and Skype consultations now.
Wow. Yeah, the impact of this, I think, I don't know, when do you think we'll start seeing it? The next 5 years or so? Detransition is coming out, 10 years?
My experience of the medical establishment in Australia is that there is no accountability, and the cover-ups are profound and constant. And just like if there's a stillbirth and a home birth, that not always, I have to say, not always, that's calmed down a lot now that home birth is largely inaccessible to 99% of Australian women. But what used to happen was that there would be a huge blow up and the midwives and the women and everyone would be named and shamed, and it would be quite horrific. And yet when similar things happen in hospitals, it's completely silent, totally and utterly silent. And sometimes because they have really sharp, pointy things and they have drugs in hospitals, the things that can go wrong are, generally speaking, far worse than anything you can do in a normal physiological birth in your home. So no one's going to inject cleaning fluid into a woman's spine in her home, as they did in St George Hospital a couple of years ago. Have we heard any more about that? No, never, not a thing. You know, there was a really tragic, terrible case in Melbourne where a woman was given a strategic reduction of a twin pregnancy. It was discovered very late in the pregnancy that one of the babies had dwarfism and significant heart problems. So the hospital suggested to this mother that she have a late-term abortion of that fetus. Instead, they injected the healthy, normal fetus. So then both babies were immediately born under caesarean section and both died. And the woman went from the hospital to a psych hospital, right? Was there an inquest into this? No, because both babies were born dead. Why were both babies born dead? Because the hospital killed the wrong fetus.
Sorry,
right?
is there some legal loophole that if the baby's born dead,
That's right. If it's a stillbirth, then in theory, unless it's at home, then the law goes out the window. In theory, there isn't an inquest. But the hospital was able to cover that up, right? So I can see the exact same collegial cover-ups will occur about this stuff unless the Australian public really get noisy and speak out about it. And I realise that for detransitioners, this is a terrifying prospect because a lot of people, really sadly, feel very foolish about having done this to themselves. Whereas I think as feminists, our critique of that is quite different. It is a system. It is a highly financed system. It is designed to convince you that what you've diagnosed in yourself is real and that all of these really profound, irreversible medical procedures are to your benefit. And the community that is offered to people under these circumstances is very appealing. So a lot of detransitioners, and I know you'll have seen this as well, blame themselves, which I think is tragic, because I have seen women for 20 years now blaming themselves for what was done to them in the hospital system when they had their babies.
Yeah.
And yet, again, you are one lone individual against an incredibly powerful corporatized system, which is designed to get you in and funnel you out like a minced meat, right? Yeah. So unless those people really, really speak up, I'm not seeing that we're going to have a huge deal. I mean, look what happened with lobotomies, right? They just stopped doing them. And then everyone kind of faded away. And the main American doctor who loved that shit has a hospital named after him to this day.
Oh, wow.
So, you know, when we make these comparisons between things like lobotomy and sterilising and castrating teenagers, which I think is a pretty good parallel, I don't really have a lot of hope with that stuff. Yeah. In Australia, in most states, there are civil liability acts, and it is under those acts that generally you can sue for medical negligence. But what's the test, right? And this is why women can't sue for their terrible birth experiences as well. The doctors have it sewn up. The test is, well, was this a way out practitioner, or does everyone do it like that? Well, everyone's doing it like that. So even if it's the worst shitty medicine you can possibly imagine with the worst possible outcomes, and we all know there's around 60% of women who have their forearm remodeled into a flesh tube and attached to their groin, around 60% of those have quite significant side effects and terrible things happen to them after the surgery. But everyone's doing it, so it doesn't matter. You can't sue.
It cost upwards of $15,000 just to begin a medical negligence claim, because I investigated it on behalf of my brother who was brain damaged at birth through medical negligence. And so that was probably 3 or 4 years ago, $15,000 just to start the claim. So that, you know, most people who've undergone some horrific medical procedure or through gender surgery or whatever aren't in the mental or financial position to even begin to pursue some justice.
We're really going to need lawyers to step up and work pro bono. I mean, as you would both know, we not only have Dentons in Sydney and around Australia, but the legal institutions in our society are utterly captured by this stuff, which is why the family court never, ever, ever once said no to somebody seeking hormones, a child, that is, seeking hormones. And we also have dedicated trans legal services in Australia, though we're not allowed to have dedicated women's legal services in Australia. Plus, all of the community legal centres are completely captured, and many of them do pro bono work because they see themselves as these knights in shining armour, pushing the boundaries and trying to remove parental control and responsibility for their children. So that's covered, right? This is why they can take their cases all the way to the High Court. This is why there are so many people can line up if parents don't agree instantly and go to court, because they don't have to pay a cent. So don't worry about it. We'll cover it. We'll do it all pro bono. So we're going to need pro bono lawyers.
And you're doing a law degree at the moment, Janet. How's that going? How long before you'll be able to offer pro bono?
I'm currently going into my 3rd year, which is secondary part-time. Well, until I have experience in that kind of stuff, you know, in the Feminist Legal Clinic where I volunteer, we see only women, and we do see women who are sometimes struggling with these kinds of issues. But, you know, it's a very tricky field right now. It's always hard to be the first woman who manages to get a case up and then even maybe progress to the point where it goes to court is going to be the guinea pig. And at the moment in our legal system, I feel very nervous about anyone who steps up to be a guinea pig, because we don't have the kinds of outcomes that they have in courts in England at the moment. You know, we saw that with Beth Rett, right?
Oh, yeah.
So I have no faith that our courts can think outside of that just now. If you look at, for instance, the Judge's Bench Book, which is a book that's given to magistrates in courts, it's a kind of a crib, you know, it's a long time since they did law. They don't necessarily remember what the leading cases about assault might be. But they are all updated with, this is how you look after trans and gender diverse people when they come before you, because they have really super hard lives.
And would that be why just this week we've seen, it must be maybe the first instance in like a court ruling of the phrase, her penis?
Well, that was a tribunal. So that's a medical board. So that's not a court. But yeah, that too would be why she put her penis between men's toes and got them to masturbate her. And that was a really tragic case. If you read all of his story, the nurse, and he's a cosmetic nurse, he's not a medicine in the hospital nurse, it was really tragic. And you could see why someone in that position would decide, well, it would be easier if I could just pretend to be a woman.
Right. I haven't read through the whole thing. Can you?
He's a man from the Philippines who came from a very religious, homophobic family. So he decided it would be easier to be a woman. So he pretends to be a woman, and apparently quite convincingly. And yet he has been known to sexually assault at least 2 men. And both of those men took those cases to Victoria Police too, who didn't charge him.
Oh.
Like, why?
Yeah.
And, you know, when I read what the board had to say, it was things like, well, we feel very uncomfortable because there's not really enough information about why the young man had his pants down and why the nurse had her pants down and what happened in the minutes between this action on the part of the nurse and what this young man did. It was victim blaming and kind of that ugly questioning of the victim of a sexual assault that we see anywhere. It just happened to be 2 men on this occasion. Yeah. And I can't help wondering if the nurse in question had genuine therapy and support, would he not be able to embrace his reality as a gay man and be a happy gay man and have normal relationships with other men rather than assaulting blindfolded men on the couch while he's waxing their back?
Wow.
Yeah.
We're going to have to finish up, but look, I am curious. I haven't read up anything on this, but like, what are the feminist recommendations for changes to the legal system that actually support victims of sexual violence?
Oh, well,
one or two.
This is really hard because what's happened in Australia is we have actually got kind of okay legislation around DV in a lot of places, for instance, but what we don't have is a feminist critique, and that's why women are being arrested by police on the say-so of an abuser.
Yes.
And that is happening more and more in Australia. So I don't know what to recommend to you, like Jocelyn Scott's work, perhaps, because she was writing back in the 80s and 90s and still to this day and is an absolute force of nature on why we need better legislation around sexual assault and rape. So perhaps Jocelyn Scott is a good person to look up. If you can find anything that Anna Kerr has written, because she does write journal articles from time to time, that would be awesome too, although I think she has written more about mothers and the family court than sexual assault, but you could still look that up.
All right. Thanks so much, Janet.
Thank
you for having me. It was a great honour. You've started something really splendid, and I know everyone loves watching, so congratulations.
Yeah. Oh, and here's a tip. Medical professionals are watching our little channel here because I have been messaged by a few, and people discover us by putting TERF into search engines and come up with us. So, there may be people with relative influence listening to us as well as our, normal fans. So
I hope so. And perhaps those people should make contact with their peers in the UK who have spoken up. And yes, it is frightening. And yes, your livelihood might be under threat. But as those people have decided, they cannot, in all conscience, continue to see children being sterilised and mutilated under the current medical regimes. So if you would be brave enough to speak up anonymously to the press, if you would be a whistleblower, we would all be incredibly grateful. And I know there's a lot of children out there who need to be saved from this pernicious ideology.
Yeah.
Well,
thank you for having me.
Well said. Thanks for coming on, Janet.
Thanks. Bye.
See you then. Bye. Cool. That was good.
Yeah. I like getting my lefties on because we're all so angry.
We didn't stray into Kath Deves territory too much, but a little bit, yeah. Some really shocking stuff. Like just the injustice for women in this world. It just drives me mad.
Yeah. I found the whole Amber Heard, Johnny Depp thing quite triggering this week because Amber Heard hasn't even given her testimony, and yet the whole world's convinced that she's the primary abuser. Not even they're both as bad as each other, which I probably agree with, but, they've demonised her. And most of the abuse and hate I've seen of her have come from women, fans of Johnny Depp's movie career. So the lack of critical thought about, how domestic violence worked, about reactive abuse, about the fact that she was in her 20s at the time and obviously not quite understanding the dynamic of dating someone 20-something years older than you. People are any excuse to demonize women, they're just going down with it.
I haven't followed the Depp, and
I try not to, but because it's just so thick and so tabloidy and
But you know what happened yesterday? One of the other admins for my page posted a screenshot of one of Sal Grover's tweets, and Sal was just saying, the figures are in, it's males who commit violence against women, and she went on a little bit, and this is why we need female only spaces, and the number of people in the comments that were like, no. And women in the comments saying, no, this doesn't represent my views, speak for yourself, blah, blah, blah. And some fucking man jumps in there and was like, oh, I can't support this page, something along those lines. Why are you demonizing men? And he's linked to some fucking group that has started collecting domestic violence statistics.
Brotherhood of Fathers or one of them, my mates over there.
To prove that women are just as violent as men. Like, it is just like so not based in reality. And I know from speaking with Anna Kerr that, those statistics are probably skewed, because what happens is a woman who's been abused for years on end, will throw a pen at their abusive partner. He comes over, beats the shit out of her. She ends up in hospital with, black eyes and a concussion. And the fucking cops will charge her with assault for having thrown the pen at him. Like shit like that. So of course these, these statistics are going to be skewed.
Look, police statistics don't lie. I mean, apart from the fact that now women are committing sexual offences with their penises. But generally, police stats on DV don't lie. And the vast majority of serious crimes are perpetrated by men against women and other men. It's just a fact.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, but all of social media, the whole internet's just a cesspit at the moment where, this tribalism.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I just don't understand how women can betray each other the way that they do.
Yeah.
You know, even as a young woman, you know, peer pressure, influenced by peer pressure and you know, wanting to build a dream home with a bloke. Even when I was young and relatively naive, I didn't really understand women piling on each other. I still don't.
Yeah, same. Speaking of social media being a cesspit, it was Lesbian Day of Visibility on, I think it was the 26th of April, and on Twitter, ACON decided to platform that dude. Look, I think he fits the profile of autogynephilia. They featured him on the ABC episode of You Can't Ask That, where they looked at lesbians. And you know, a man that calls himself a lesbian, you know, the biggest LGBTQIA++ charity in Australia, platforming a man as a lesbian on Lesbian Day of Visibility. Like, the world is just upside down.
Well, I saw every single thing for Lesbian Day of Visibility I saw was lesbian and other LGBT women. None of them were just lesbians. They were all and.
Outright.
Lesbians and men.
It's just appalling.
It's infuriating.
All right. Any other, we need to finish up. But...
Oh, yeah, I want a bit of self-promotion here. I had a chat to Sal Grover for her Giggle Podcast, and that came out a couple of days ago. And it was really nice to expand on some of the things that I talk about here, you know, to a greater degree. So yeah, have a listen. It's $3 a month and you get to listen to heaps and heaps of cancelled women. And another thing that Sal did as part of Giggle Podcasts was she released the Respect Your Sex spokespeople talking about their involvement in that. Can we call it a campaign? Is the Electoral Commission listening in that campaign? And that is actually free. So if you have a listen, Sal's managed to engage some really interesting women and me and talk about their involvement in the trans rights movement and how they've been cancelled and how they've come to have the opinions that they have, the controversial opinions that they hold. So yeah, well worth a listen.
All right, well, let's end it there. But I'm going to try and do this every episode. Shout out to Beth Rep. If you would like to come on TERF Talk and share your story, please do. You will find links to the page I run in the description down below. Just shoot me a message and let's see if we can get Beth Rep's story out there.
Miss Beth. I was in a few groups with Beth, and I was probably one of the people that got her into trouble by commenting on her page. But anyway, yeah, it'd be great to hear from her, because a lot of us have been, you know, worried about her and wondering what's been happening, because she was a real trailblazer for us. And yeah, she was just one of the first of many women dragged to tribunal by vexatious trans people. Yeah.
All right. Thanks for watching, everyone.
Thank you.
And next week, please like and share, and see you then.
Bye. Bye.